Good evening and welcome back. Our panel tonight is Parish and Educational Ministry in the Aftermath of Abuse. My name is Stacy Noem. I'm part of the faculty at the University of Notre Dame Theology Department, and I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. First, we'll have Anselma Dulcich-Ashley. Anselma taught biology at a Jesuit high school before obtaining her Master's of Divinity degree from Weston School of Theology in 1988. She then served as a campus minister for the Archdiocese of Chicago, appointed to the John Paul II Catholic Student Center at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and later at St. Mary's College, Notre Dame, Indiana. She completed her PhD in moral theology at Notre Dame in 2011, with a dissertation examining the Catholic sexual abuse crisis from a comprehensive moral theological perspective, under the direction of Professor Jean Porter. She taught undergraduate courses in theology at Notre Dame as a concurrent assistant professor, while also serving as an assistant teacher professor in the Glynn Family Honors Program at Notre Dame. Having retired from these posts last year, she's now an independent scholar and divides her time between Boulder, Colorado, and South Bend. To her right is Father Kevin Grove, CSC, an assistant professor of systematic theology at Notre Dame and a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross. He has ministered in 2 parishes in Michiana, as well as served university faculty and students at the University of Cambridge, and now at the University of Notre Dame. As a member of the theology faculty at Notre Dame, he is chaplain to the Masters of Divinity program, which prepares lay ecclesial ministers, as well as seminarians and brothers in the Congregation of Holy Cross for ministry. Eric T. Stiles, since 2016, has served as rector of Carroll Hall, an intentional undergraduate residential community at the University of Notre Dame. A Chicago native, he holds degrees from the University of Cincinnati and Loyola University Chicago. Eric worked as a parish liturgy coordinator at St. Benedict, the African Catholic Church in Chicago, and as a house manager for the theater school of DePaul University. He discerned religious life for 7 years with the Society of Jesus, during which time he prayed the 30-day retreat designed by St. Ignatius Loyola and received formal training in spiritual direction. He later left the Jesuits and eventually found his way to St. Mary's University of Minnesota, where he worked as a campus minister for liturgy and faith formation. Now at Notre Dame, he continues to assist as a retreat leader and an occasional spiritual director. Eric remains active in the performing arts as a collaborator with Afro House, a Baltimore-based music-driven performance art ensemble. Eric writes about theology, liturgy, and contemporary culture for publications like America, Church Life Journal, and the U.S. Catholic. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. As you know, our panelists will each speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for question and answer. Anselma will start us off.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me know if you can't hear me. I just want to say to start how much I appreciate being here with the panelists who have come before. I really feel very honored and just incredibly encouraged that you all are doing such amazing work and you're so dedicated and you really care about survivors and about the church. It's great to be here with you. So about 10 years ago, I undertook as a dissertation project an ethical deep dive into those early years of the crisis, starting with the publication of the Boston Globe Spotlight series. The goal was to, as Stacy mentioned, comprehending critique from a moral theological perspective. First of all, what is going on in the crisis, and secondly, official church responses to it. I used as data 5 years of the publication Origins, the official publication of the U.S. Catholic bishops, every statement that they published there during that 5 years, and I sincerely hope that God in His mercy will dock me a little bit of time in purgatory for having done that. So that's what I did, and I think, you know, when I started to think about my thoughts, I found it very useful to return to this embarrassing and humiliating period. We see the church in its official responses caught like a deer in the headlights, trying to understand myself, what are they saying, and how is it, and this was an experience of grace, I think, that I'm seeing survivors, families, and their advocates bringing about more authentic church relationships even as they're struggling in their pain. So generally at this time, just very generally. Responses, the official responses from bishops and other church officials showed two features. One is that it was very much driven by ecclesiology, right? So there's a defense of a kind of ecclesiology centered on the church, or on the clergy, excuse me. And the other characteristic that was very obvious was that the interpretation of the actions of abuser priests was made according to the strict legal mandates in the Code of Canon Law, not from moral theology. So it's ecclesiology and canon law that I was seeing, not moral theology. Specifically, the moral theology of the sixth commandment, Exodus 20:14, you shall not commit adultery is what would be the commandment of the Decalogue that's appropriate here. Interestingly, not only did theologically uneducated laity show a better, if intuitive, grasp of the demands of this commandment, because it is a commandment not just of those 5 words, but a commandment of the cardinal virtue of justice, but also American civil laws and criminal codes, having themselves gone through this huge sea change over the 20th century in terms of victim advocacy, whether it's rape victim or, as we heard earlier, different racial groups, et cetera. We're still in that, obviously, trying to figure it out as Americans. They had undergone significant changes regarding the rights of and responses to victims of crimes, redefining and respecifying the nature of what is going on in a crime. They were also more closely aligned to the demands of justice. So I had to ask, why and how did the Catholic Church, that enduring community, which of all institutions ought to have understood and lived by its own moral commandments, its own 10 commandments of the Decalogue, commandment number 6 being the relevant one, fail so spectacularly? And how might the abuse crisis, for all its tragedy, lead to recognizable positive changes? So I have 3 parts here. The first part is just to trace an understanding of what was going on in the crisis in those early years, crime to crisis to apocalypse. The second part is to discuss a little bit of moral theology, having to do with what does the 6th commandment really mean, and then by way of conclusion, I will have some comments on hierarchy and synodality. So, crime to crisis to apocalypse. Other speakers before me have already talked about this, that regarding clergy, bishops' responses to allegations, very much based on canon law, which defines this is a delict or an offense against the 6th commandment as a discrete action whereby a priest who is the agent of the act has broken his vow of celibacy in committing sexual acts outside of, obviously, the sacrament of marriage, because he's a priest. So defined, the focus is on the offender, the agent of the act. Official responses revolved around removing the problem priests and assuring congregations that these problem priests, quote unquote, are far fewer in number than righteous and well-serving priests. So, for example, here's one of the quotes from that period in Origins. I want to say a word about the more than 40,000 wonderful priests in our country who get up every morning to give their lives in full service to the church as witnesses to Jesus Christ in our midst. I am very saddened that the crimes of a few have cast a shadow over the grace-filled and necessary work that they do day in and day out for society and for the church. The priesthood is a unique treasure of the church, and I give you my assurance that we are doing everything to ensure that we have worthy and healthy candidates for the priesthood and to strengthen the many priests who faithfully fulfill their ministry on behalf of all of us. We deplore the sexual abuse of young people, etc. But then the statement goes on, the damage, however, has been immeasurable. The toll this phenomenon has taken on our people and our ministry is tremendous. And that is a statement by Bishop Wilton Gregory, at the time USCCB president and Bishop of Belleville, Illinois, in 2002, in a statement entitled Action to Address Clergy Sexual Abuse of Minors. So in this statement, the emphasis is on these great priests, and look, I know a lot of them. I'm sitting next to one of them, of course, who are horrified. I mean, because they're such wonderful people, they are horrified, and it's like, they were all saying, don't call attention to the good work we're doing, try to clean up what's going on. But the idea that the sex abuse crisis is taking a toll on us good priests and all of our good ministries, is just, shifting the focus. It's a distraction, from the real work at hand, okay? So statements like that one, it doesn't take much critical thinking to see that the focus on direct offenders or on the good work the church is doing overlooks something very huge. Obviously, the direct victims and survivors, the original and ongoing trauma sustained by these survivors, as well as by their families and loved ones, as well as by their parish or school communities, where even non-involved individuals, and I kind of count myself as one of them, were horrified by abuse revelations. Probably all of you that were just kind of parrot people in the pew, and you feel it, right? So while the U.S. bishops did quickly show contrition, offered apologies, there was a slowness to recognize their own what is called material cooperation or formal cooperation in the crimes of direct perpetrators. So formal cooperation is when you knowingly, like say a bishop knowingly reassigns a known perpetrator with very strong allegations. Material cooperation is when they might have reassigned somebody that they didn't know was abusing anybody. And the issue with material cooperation, of course, is that if you're the bishop, you should have known, like you're in that place of responsibility where you should know what's going on and how serious these matters can be. Another issue was just the slowness to grasp the many and diverse behaviors that can be called sexual abuse, and that can cause great harm, and this has come up in some of the prior presenters. It's not just like what we think of as, say, rape, but a whole variety of behaviors from grooming and etc. Excuse me. So, by depicting the crisis largely within the contours of law breaking, the bishops failed to make use of very traditional categories within Catholic moral theology, which would have contributed to a more detailed, accurate, and truthful understanding of what is going on. I think that phrase, what is going on, I think that's from H. Richard Niebuhr, actually, when he says one of the most important things in ethics is just to know what is going on, right? It's not that the bishops were extremely callous about victims. I mean, they didn't ignore that. Rather, statements at the time focused largely on the act of sexual molesting and the agents of that act, the perpetrators, and how to handle the agents, and not on those who were harmed either directly or indirectly. And also, we just need to say that what canon law expresses in a bland-sounding statement, a delict against the sixth commandment, is actually, is actually something that's causing horrific and severe trauma, bland though it may sound. And finally, as we heard earlier today, structures of transparency and accountability were quite insufficient, and they seem to have remained so. Let's see if there's, I have another quote, but that's for farther down. Okay, so as if these statements are not painful enough to read, there also existed, and this was not in the bishop statements, this was in the accompanying Boston Globe investigation and undergoing at the same time as these statements from Origen, a kind of deference to church authorities shown among laity. That's hard to read, and I think very helpful reading for anybody who's Catholic, because they had been taught that deference to clergy and deference to pastors and bishops is actually a virtue. They, when you read those Boston Globe Spotlight stories and other stories from other sources, you see over and over lay people saying how reluctant they were, how scared they were to take matters to their pastors or bishops. They were afraid to speak up, or if they did, their pastors or bishops would assure them they had matters under control, and they would just feel awful. Don't say anything, it's for the good of the church, that kind of thing. So that's the crime. From crime to crisis now. The crime became a crisis when mostly lay people, survivors and their families and advocates, although fearing repercussions or condemnation, rejected the orders or pleas or the deference that they had been taught not to do anything about known clerical abuse, and they went to their local prosecutor, attorney, or law enforcement people. Okay, so I'm seeing this little crucible happening again and again. That's the crucible of the crisis, where the lay people said, I'm not going to go to the bishop anymore. I'm going to somebody who can bring about justice. Church authorities had been doing the wrong thing, not in simply misunderstanding the nature of what was going on, but also not heeding the victims, as we've been hearing today, showing patterns of consulting lawyers instead of listening to the traumatized, taking partial steps that yet allowed known abusers back into ministry, not telling congregations about the history of abuse in their own parishes, falling back on, and this is a lot of what I had to read, generalized expressions of sympathy twinned with exculpatory strategies, such as, these crimes happened before I became bishop, or something like that, and a lot of other actions. So, they're trying to get out of any kind of, moral or legal entanglement. So one of the more raw statements that actually appeared in Origins, you have to really read a lot of these statements, and it's almost like you're looking for a needle in a haystack, because the kind of incriminating material is buried in the middle of stuff that you'd say, oh yeah, of course, there are 40,000 priests in this country who are doing great ministry, whatever it is. So this is from Bishop Thomas O'Brien of Phoenix. Is it possible to second-guess decisions that have been made? Yes. Hindsight is 20/20. Have I committed a crime? No. Many of the allegations date back to the 70s, before I was bishop. We did our best then, and we are doing our best now to ensure that the children in our schools and churches are safe. It was never my intention to obstruct or interfere in any way. I certainly never intentionally placed a child in harm's way. To suggest a cover-up is just plain false. I did not oversee decades of wrongdoing. The problem of sexual abuse is complex and has plagued every aspect of our society for decades. This is not a problem unique to the Catholic Church. And this was a statement upon his agreement with the Maricopa County attorney in Origins in 2003. So rather than seek prosecution, just so you know, the Maricopa County attorney worked out an agreement with O'Brien for the county prosecutor's office to monitor internal diocesan practices and policies regarding protection of children and young people. So, unable to trust that their own church personnel would take the right steps towards justice, survivors, parents, and advocates representing the survivors essentially were claiming their own authority in this matter against the directives or policies of their bishop, in a sense throwing off that aforementioned deference that I had mentioned earlier. Theologically speaking, what I see here are parents who are themselves baptized priest, prophet, and king, who are themselves claiming the proper governing authority to speak for their own family, like in the case of a minor child, to speak for their own child and to take protection of their own child, claiming those baptismal charisms against the ordained charism of priest, prophet, and king that the bishop has, right? And the same would be true of survivors who claimed personal authority for the protection of their own bodies and minds, who were of age to take action themselves. As mentioned, our civil society already had a model in place for protections, procedures, et cetera, to handle cases of sexual assault and harassment and so on. So the laity started making use of these tools. I think, though, that we can see this as a kind of emergent synodality going on. That's what I think. And it was painful as lay Catholics experienced this interruption of the old deferential conditioning to defer ultimate moral responsibility to the clergy. So the crux of the crisis again occurred when parental authority takes authentic priority over the authority of a bishop in matters of the safety and well-being of their own children. So one thing for teachers and ministers to think about is just what are ways in which we can recognize and teach the people that we are working with to recognize and understand and responsibly exercise their own authority in their lives. The International Theological Commission defines synodality as, quote, the action of the Spirit in the communion of the body of Christ and in the missionary journey of the people of God. And this action that parents and survivors were now taking, it seems to me, is a great example of that. The action of the Spirit in the community of the body of Christ in the missionary journey. So from crisis to apocalypse now. It's important to recognize the meaning of the word apocalypse, obviously. We all know it doesn't mean, no matter what the movies say, the end of the world, overthrow, violence, everything's crashing down. It just means revealing, or literally an unveiling. So what was unveiled, you might say the Apostle Paul got it right in Romans 8:16. The creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. And we saw the children revealing themselves as survivors of these heinous crimes, and a church that was, not doing anything about it. We began to recognize that their suffering, the lack of sufficient church response, was shining a light onto and revealing massive shortcomings in Catholic institutions and in the ministry of Catholic authorities, bishops, priests, teachers, diocesan personnel, etc. Another thing about apocalypse is it unveils something. It's the truth that it unveils, and of course the truth hurts, so often. Apocalypse can also mean the revealing of things that are known, but that we really didn't want to think about or deal with, or we thought was unimportant. So I think of, it had been Lumen Gentium, especially, that really made quite clear that people are baptized, all Catholics, all Christians are baptized, priest, prophet, and king. That's just been around since forever, but now we saw it. The old deference was clouding it over, and now we are seeing the truth of who I am as a baptized Catholic. So we could ask ourselves, how do we, in our parishes and schools and other ministries, constantly seek to understand the truth of a matter, constantly unveiling. And finally, in this section, in a classic example of what is called often beginner's mind, which I think is a term that might come from Buddhism, but I know psychologists make a lot of use of it. There's that mentality that isn't weighed down with conditioning, complications, distractions, baggage, whatever. Survivors and their parents and their advocates revealed a much better grasp of the relevant commandment of the Decalogue, the sixth commandment, against adultery, in terms of grasping the moral import of this commandment as a precept of justice. They did this intuitively and actively because they loved their children, they had a healthy self-love for themselves, and accepted responsibility for protecting themselves if they were old enough, or protecting their children, and not because they held any kind of expertise in church affairs or canon law or theology. So, finally, in Revelation, in Apocalypse, the crisis revealed that the sixth commandment was poorly understood by church authorities, and probably by a lot of other Catholics. So let's turn to the sixth commandment and what's going on here. All right, Exodus 20, verse 14, you shall not commit adultery, 5 words in English. Seen as only these words, and believe me, I have memorized these like you all have too, for many quizzes and tests. You just kind of belt them out along with, the memorare and everything else that you've memorized, right? And it seems like it's all about, well, just don't do this, right? It may seem like the sixth is restricted to those who break the rule, the priest abusers. As I've mentioned, though, and as we all know, the complete moral picture must include some account of the harmful effect of breaking this rule on the survivors. Eventually, it will have implications on relationships. What are our relationships like, whether or not we are survivors of sexual abuse, with our clergy and other church authorities? So I think that's where a lot of, kind of deer in the headlights moments happen. It's like, that's what it means, isn't it? Look, it's in the Bible, it's in canon law, what's the problem? Well, going back to the Catholic moral theological tradition in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas, all 10 commandments of the Decalogue are, first of all, precepts of natural law. They are also moral norms that constitute divine revelation. And finally, they are precepts, in this case, the second tablet of the Decalogue, are precepts of a particular virtue, namely justice. As Aquinas writes in his inimitable style in the Summa, the precepts of the second table of the Decalogue contain the order of justice to be observed among men, that nothing undue be done to anyone, and that each be given his due. So notice the way he's turning that logic from you as an agent, me as an agent, just don't do this, to when you do this, how are you having an effect on somebody? That's the definition of justice, to each their due, right? He just kind of does this little logical thing and says, no, what it means is if this act is committed, there's going to be harm. Harm is injustice. That's kind of the logic here. So similar to its companion precepts, like the seventh, you shall not steal, which receives a lot of treatment in Catholic social teaching, having to do with economies and all kinds of things, not just individual thieves, right? Prohibiting adultery expresses a fundamental moral norm of the cardinal virtue of justice for people who, by their very nature, live and interact together in social contexts. So it's going to call into question, what are your relationships like? Are your relationships just? Okay, do they have the telos of justice? There are specific paradigmatic behaviors that express this fundamental precept, that express the sixth commandment and the other commandments there on the second table. One of them is refraining from adultery, okay? Because in adultery, someone, perhaps many people, get hurt. But prohibiting harm by its own internal logic of justice also calls for other behaviors, such as, okay, if you're going to prohibit harm from happening, well, okay, then you're going to have to get out there and protect those who are vulnerable to those who might be breaking this commandment. Okay? So in the early phase, what I was seeing is like I say, a very ecclesiological and canon law-based response, and a very insufficient grasp of the breadth of harms caused by the breach of this prohibition. When the crisis is defined as a problem of abuser priests alone, the remedy becomes rapid response to allegations and quick removal of the so-called problem priests. And then they institute all kinds of training programs, right, in ministry locations. But when the sixth is seen through the lens of its moral grounding in natural and divine law and the cardinal virtue of justice, a far more serious view and far broader view obtains. The abuse of justice concerns the violation of the humanity and the human dignity of thousands of direct victims. It has to do with any harm related to the body, bodily safety, boundaries between people, relational or physical, what happens when people gather together. I mean, you name it. It's very, very broad. Now, simultaneously, and not as a ripple effect of individual survivors having been harmed, not as a ripple effect, but simultaneously with that very action of harm, commonly understood and approved and agreed upon sexual boundaries became unpredictable. I mean, as a parent, the first thing you ask is, are my kids safe? You know, you're just like, I don't know. It's like the way in secular society they'll publish addresses of people who are not in prison, have been released from prison, say, but they are convicted murderers or convicted sex felons, etc., so that you can know where they are. They won't let certain people live so close to schools and all of that. It's the communal boundaries we're holding up here. So, and not only that, but relational boundaries were becoming not only unreliable, but harmful. People were... people could not trust bishops or pastors, as we know. So I think the question is, again, for ministry, when we teach commandments and laws, it's not just what does the law say and spit it out on the quiz. What is just here? What is fair? Who has been harmed? Who has been harmed? Thinking of the earlier speaker about the preferential option, right? How might the governing structures of the Catholic Church need to change in order to reliably prevent harms and enable justice? So that's the six in a nutshell. 5 little words that have this enormous impact thanks to the shining light of Aquinas's brain. But by way of conclusion, synodality and hierarchy. Okay. In English, the word hierarchy, whether it's in the church or in the corporate world, has taken on a somewhat unfortunate connotation because what it really means is hierarchy, like up here, right? The hierarchy are up above me, and so it happens in the corporate world too, right? All the communication comes down from up above, the directives get sent down, and everybody down here obeys the directives. It's really H-I-G-H-E-R, archy. And I think if it didn't have the same sound as H-I-G-H-E-R, we wouldn't have so much of a conniption, but that's the way it is. So here's the hierarchy. Here's like us down here, the lowerarchy, if you want to call it that. That's what I remember us using that term in my MDiv, just to kind of keep things straight. Hierarchy, the word. Okay, this is the etymology now. It's not higher, H-I-G-H. It's H-I-E-R, sacred, holy. Archy, arche, order. And order doesn't mean organization. It's not like you have to have a certain kind of model of church organization. It means the kinds of relationships. Are your relationships just? Are they righteous? Are they full of love? You know, are we, well, as the Acts of the Apostles said, you know, the first followers of Jesus didn't call themselves Catholics or even Christian, right? They called themselves followers of the way. That's the holy order. We're on the way, the pilgrim people, practicing, trying to do as Jesus did and living righteously according to the commandments that we have. Okay, so if you understand it that way, hierarchy, as it were, expresses a synodal church. I personally wouldn't mind just banning the word hierarchy and say, can we just use the word, holy order or sacred order instead? I mean, that really changes, cognitively. It reframes who we are as church. It's not a church of the hierarchy, meaning H-I-G-H-E-R archy. It's a holy order of the people of God struggling to live like Jesus. The sixth commandment itself, of course, doesn't necessitate any particular external form of structural church organization, but it does, I believe, certainly it challenges the hierarchy as hierarchy, model of governance in which we see the church. The church will always have ordained governors, but it will always have baptized governors. By governor, I mean just anybody with authority, so a pastor, a bishop, but also a parent, any adult, etc. So I think in a synodal church, these roles of authority will be reflective of a sacred order, a holy order, right, in a very active and robust way. So we have seen many people challenging what I am calling the H-I-G-H-E-R archy up here. And starting with survivors, along with many Catholic professionals who have helped bishops around the world, try to draw up procedures and policies and revise norms, etc., like Miriam was talking about earlier today. And I feel like seeing these actions and thinking of hierarchy as a sacred order, I begin to see fewer like triangular top-down structures. The church is less like that and more like a circle where we're all working together for our children, promoting justice. It's my hope that with these efforts, our church is moving from a governance model, which has been characterized and apparently still is, by anxiously circling the wagons for the sake of security, to one that is instead lovingly encircling the wounded for healing, following the model of Jesus. And just as an example, about a year and a half ago, 2 years maybe, there was an art installation by an Irish artist named Trina McKillen called Confess. And it was at Loyola Marymount and traveled to a couple places elsewhere in the US. But the idea is that she took First communion dresses and altar boy outfits. And she had like a whole, 30 or 40 of them. And they were all fluffed out, so that it looked like there were people in them, but they was kind of ghostly. They're kind of hanging there, in this gallery. And I thought, if every parish had something like that you could walk past on your way going into Mass, or it would be in a special chapel where you could go and really reflect on this particular, this crisis. It's something like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, in Washington, D.C., if you've been there. You have to travel through it and feel the pain, even if it didn't affect you personally. And I think, gosh, that's maybe the kind of thing we need to do to promote a sacred order within the church, following the lines of moral theology in the Sixth Commandment.
Thank you, Dr. Dulcich Ashley. We'll move on over to Father Kevin Grove.
It's an honor for It's an honor for me to participate in this panel tonight, especially with Anselma and Eric. I'm grateful to be here with both of them and admire their work very much. The three of us at the outset, or the first day at least of this conference, are charged with introducing the range of ministerial settings to a sense, and the challenge and hopes of those settings. And to that end, all three of us bring very different expertise to the question. And because of the particular vantages from which we address the abuse crisis are important, I wish to start with just a few bits about my own context that shape how I consider accountability, healing, and trust, and then the 3 points I'll make for my part of our panel this night. And in particular, for my own context, as an adult, and certainly as a minister, the Catholic Church, as shattered by and failing to respond to the abuse crisis, is the only church that I have known. I was a sophomore in college when the abuse crisis broke in Boston, and upon graduation, entered formation in the Congregation of Holy Cross, the religious order here at Notre Dame, and in which I continue as a vowed religious. There are some members of my community here this night and as part of the conference. This is important context in a couple of ways for the constructive points I wish to make in a few minutes. First, I had to grapple with this church as a place to do ministry at the time I was discerning religious life and priesthood as an undergraduate. Second, the way in which I see ministerial priesthood depicted in mid-20th century movies, and how some of my friends, both lay colleagues and confreres in my own religious community, describe the way in which Catholics equated the church with the ordained priesthood, and has always been wrong and alarming both, but also not my experience. I was a transitional deacon when I first heard the story of a parent and churchgoer whose child had been abused by a Catholic priest. Really just a new minister. I had been a priest less than a year before I was asked by a stranger on the street if I were a child molester. And I'm in no way speaking against the righteous anger of those who rightly stand up for the abused, the marginalized, and those whose voices have been taken away from them wrongly. But when that stranger, by extension or association, casts the anger at oneself, it's arresting in such a powerful way that it can make one miss a step. So, the church in which I minister and teach is one that for the whole of that time has been coming to terms with, or often failing to come to terms with, its ongoing brokenness. My experience of that has been in 3 ministerial contexts. I worked in 2 parishes here in Indiana before graduate study in Cambridge, England, where I was assistant chaplain there for the university students and faculty at the University of Cambridge. Since that time, I've been back at Notre Dame, teaching students in our theology department. It's a joy to see some of you here this evening, and serving as a priest in residence or pastoral minister in a resident community here on campus at Notre Dame. Eric runs one of those communities. I offer all of that by way of introducing the heart of my comments on ministry. For at the end of the day, I do still love this church, but only because it's Christ's. And I explained to a secular colleague who could not seem to comprehend this, a dear friend, that I offer that there are parts of all of our identities that we have to grieve. For instance, I am an American, and while I can be proud of that, that doesn't mean there aren't times of shame and even grieving for the collective action of my nation. The same is true of my church, and I'll speak about how I work through that theologically in just a bit. For now, I'd like to focus my remarks around three particular issues in ministry. Since the abuse-ridden church is the only one I've known, these are not analyses of causes or what precipitated the crisis. They're reflections on ministry and theology since it has begun. They include three areas. First, the professionalization of ministry. Second, new chapters and challenges, frankly, concerning authority. And third, reasons for hope, or theological paradigms for us being together, what I will call an ecclesiology of groaning. So first, the professionalization of ministry. One of the very good things that has emerged, really beginning after the Dallas Charter, but now continuing in lay and seminary ministerial formation programs, is what I'm calling for shorthand the professionalization of ministry. This has not been, as some feared, a scary thing at all. People wondered, I think, and Selma can attest to this, at the time of the scandal initially, if there would be able to be meaningful interactions between ministers and those whom they were serving without mediating or supervising entities. The last 20 years have proven that more professional development of our ministers is good all the way around. And here are four particular ways that that is advantageous. First, the development of healthy ministerial boundaries. Here at Notre Dame, our Master of Divinity degree provides formation for both lay ecclesial and ordained ministers. Since the abuse crisis, that formation has included extensive and ongoing reflection about boundaries that are healthy. Some of these were obvious correctives for times in which vulnerable people were taken advantage of. Ministers are no longer in obvious ways alone with minors in cars in places of residence and the like. That was the easy and the obvious. But this has brought about consideration of boundaries that help ministers to think about their own identities and what it means for them to serve in ways that are healthy for themselves and those around them. Our lay ministers, and Stacy Noem here at my left is the director of that formation program, have to establish boundaries in terms of the difference, for instance, between their ministries and their families, their life of work that sustains them, and what sustains them spiritually and emotionally. Similarly, here, our priests and religious in formation now look in a different way at the way their commitment to their communal life, faith sharing, spiritual direction, and support allow them to minister in an ongoing and healthy way. In short, the broad field development and establishment by professional ministers of boundaries does not keep them from doing good ministry, but supports them in it in all other parts of their ministry. Second, on the ground, lay people in the church responded impressively in terms of basic formation for parishes and schools in terms of safeguarding. The students in my dormitory just this week are planning to do tutoring at a local Catholic primary school. They've taken into account the fact that their background checks and safeguarding training all have to be processed before they can begin. Further, gone are the days when I, as a priest, can go roving around, presiding at weddings, baptisms, or saying masses just with the card that in the old days one carried in his wallet and was called a celebret, Latin for let him celebrate. Rather, my paperwork as a priest in good standing must be processed and approved wherever I go in this country. And in that regard, having lived abroad, what we together as Catholics have done in this country in that regard is impressive. That students, coaches, after-school carers, and others should de facto be trained in abuse prevention and reporting is noble and impressive. Third, on professionalization, the structure of reporting abuses has been professionalized. Mandatory reporting for all situations outside of the seal of confession allows for competent authorities to determine whether or not action needs to be taken in a particular situation. And sacramental spaces that demand confidence have since been overhauled. Even our confessionals here at Notre Dame now have frosted glass behind the priest. It's subtle in architectural appearance, but a new day in ecclesial transparency. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, in both our lay and seminary contexts here, formation for integrated human sexuality is part and parcel, it's just assumed, of our formation for ministry. It's no longer taboo, but a regular part of conversation, and simply one aspect of what it means to be a well-formed minister, adult, and member of the body of Christ. These four aspects of the professionalization of our ministry formation programs, boundaries, safeguarding, reporting, and formation for integrated human sexuality, are a multi-pronged approach that is working and should be encouraged. None of these are guarantees against future abuse, but they do form a bedrock upon which good ministry might take place. If the first point about the professionalization of ministry was meant to be optimistic, this one unfortunately is not. 3.5 years ago, the then American Cardinal Theodore McCarrick resigned from the College of Cardinals and was eventually laicized on account of accusations of abuse of a minor. In terms of power and authority, there's no doubt that McCarrick had it. The news has already well covered the way in which he was embedded in ecclesial and national life with access to funding, personages, and clout. And without recounting all of the gory details, I recall thinking this was even worse than the news of the breaking scandal in 2002. For one of the very authorities purportedly committed to reform had in fact himself been a serial offender. Of course, degrees were rescinded, including here. McCarrick went into a life of penance, and he was removed from the clerical state. But something else broke anew in that moment. A realization that the good professionalization that had happened on the ground in the Catholic Church was not matched by the same thing at the level of authority in the last 20 years. And while this is no knock against many good leaders who do serve in our church, we have only begun to start to think as a church about what shared responsibility in the body of Christ means at the level of ecclesial shepherding, what Anselma called our governing. This is going to take time. Here on our campus, in light of the McCarrick scandal, for the first time in my ministry, we, the Holy Cross community, together decided we would address the abuse crisis in a concerted effort in our preaching at masses across campus, beginning with the opening of the school year mass, not the normal tone for that liturgy, and using that sacramental space at least to be vulnerable and to open a dialogue with our students and colleagues. This conference is part of the university's effort in that regard. The conversations are still ongoing. And I must add that the 2019 motu proprio from Pope Francis, Vos Estis, is a first step and a new one that we're still seeing how it might function. But it's an attempt to fill a gap, that authorities have to be just as responsible for abuse as coaches with CYO teams and local pastors. Francis's move, in some ways, is a professionalization of ecclesial leaders in this regard. My third point is one that I draw from St. Augustine, on whom I use extensively in my own work, and the Jesuit theologian Michael McCarthy, who wrote a splendid article in Theological Studies in 2005 called An Ecclesiology of Groaning. Without going too far into the weeds, Augustine's insight as he preached was of an ever-increasing understanding of what it meant to be the whole, or the complete or total Christ. If one understood that Christ was really speaking in the scriptures, in the voices of broken humans, then Christ was speaking in the experience of those in their own time. This obligated them in a new way to recognize Christ in their midst, in the widow, the poor, the orphan. They were to find themselves shifting, like Saul the persecutor in becoming Paul, to hear the voice of the Lord in their midst and start to serve the members of his body right around them who had heretofore not been heard. This process for Augustine emerged out of the Psalms of Lament. One drew closest to Christ when lamenting, when groaning. For it was in that moment of his own cry of dereliction that Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And in that extraordinary moment from the cross, he did not choose to speak a new line, but to quote Psalm 22. And if we think about it, that's a very odd line to choose. You have to forgive me for being a systematician for just a second. For if he were truly God in that moment, then he was not somehow forsaken. But if he were not truly forsaken, then divinity could be using humanity like a cheap puppet, as if God were some sort of divine ventriloquist. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And Augustine's great insight was that in that moment, Christ took up human experience at its farthest point from God, abandonment, being alone, and unto death. And there he spoke in our words so that we might speak in his. He did not take away our pain, but joined us in it, such that we might not be alone. And thus, when we lament, when we groan, we might do so in him, and him in us. That lowest point became a locus of the most marvelous Christological exchange that helped Augustine and his people in North Africa to discover the wholeness of Christ in a way that continued to challenge them concerning their awareness of the least. I find hope in this paradigm because we may need right now to be a church that laments and groans. Not only do we do so in acknowledgement of our sins, but in order that here, at the farthest point we find ourselves from the Christ in whom we place our hope, we might find him speaking in our church and in us once more. I offered earlier that there are parts of our identities that we must grieve. Our laments and our groaning may indeed be those places where Christ is most clearly present in our midst for the work ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Grove. We'll turn things over to Mr. Stiles.
We talked a couple days ago, and I started by saying, I have no presentation. I am not an expert in either theology or sex abuse or psychology, and I wanted to respond, maybe even react, and so I was grateful to not go first. And I'm grateful to Anselmo and Kevin for offering their very tight, focused presentations on the questions at hand. I'm going to respond to them as someone who is working in pastoral, full-time in pastoral ministry. One of the things that Kevin and I share is that Kevin entered the Congregation of Holy Cross in 2004, and I entered the Society of Jesus in 2004, within which I was a scholastic for 7 years, or a member for 7 years. And entered at about 27 at the time, and my mother's responses are you kidding me, right? What are you doing? This is a couple years, of course, after the scandal broke. So the context was, this was what people were thinking about, talking about constantly. And good question, I don't know what I was thinking. That's not true. I was thinking and still believe that God calls us to things that are difficult sometimes, and sometimes calls us more clearly in the midst of turmoil, to respond to a need, not unlike people, I think in World War II, just picking up and saying, yeah, me too, I'll go, in a moment of crisis. The students that I think, the things that I want to talk about are really something about the students that we now serve at a place like University of Notre Dame, who were born, most of it at this point, some of whom were born just as the scandal broke. So they have absolutely no memory of a church before the scandal. They have absolutely no memory of the church before the scandal. The challenges that they face are, to me, extraordinary. And we are all talking about mental health. We know that we are in a crisis, and we are living it probably in some form in our own environments. For me as a rector, so for those of you who don't know what a rector is here at Notre Dame, is a live-in pastoral leader who leads pastors and leads a residence hall community. This is Catholic Hogwarts, okay? So every residence hall is. I mean, it's the best way it's a quick way for people, I get it, right? Think the British house system, right? You get sorted randomly, more so than the sorting hat, right? Into a residence hall. You find yourself in a community, hopefully of care and identity. Each hall has its own identity. And so as a rector, you're a full-time live-in 24/7. When school's in, you are it. And you live and breathe life with the students. So a couple of my fellow rectors are with us here today. And so the work there is really helping the student transition into this late stage of adolescence, into adulthood, by providing for them a safe place to land as they leave, most of them leaving their family of origin for the first time. Okay? So substantial, right? And difficult sometimes, but also a lot of life in it. The rector job, we see and hear and experience a lot of the students' lives. I worked as campus minister before that, which I enjoyed the campus ministry work, but I was attracted to the intensity of this work. I wanted to see what it was going to be like. The difference is that the students don't get to opt in to a relationship with the rector as they would get to opt in to a relationship with the campus minister. Right? They can go to campus ministry or they cannot. They have to deal with the rector. When they enter into that community, they find themselves. The rector looms large in the imagination of this place, right? One of the amazing things about the work is that they call us my rector. It touches me. They are my residents. They are not the residents. They are my residents. And I am their rector. So from day one, we say that to them when they walk in the door. There is a relationship. It's not transactional. They are not my customers, right? They are my residents. And so it's an opportunity. It's a little scary because in many ways, we're talking about the professionalization of ministry, which we live with. And yet, the boundaries in the rector's life are more nebulous than I think in probably most other places in ministry because we live with them. Because they can come into my apartment and sit on my couch with my door closed and talk to me, or into my office. Of course, our students are, they might be a couple who are 17 when they walk in, but the vast majority of them are 18 and up, right? So they are legally adults. The context is that, for me, is I believe the students that we serve largely they are living through the most transformational moment in the history of the human condition. The world in which we live in is constantly changing. The ways are obvious. The technology, the access to information, their understanding of what's going on instantaneously in the world. And I think in a very significant way, their relationship to religious institutions. Remembering again that they don't know a church before the scandal. So when the McCarrick report broke, Father Mike, who's here, who's my priest in residence, he lives with us. Has he lived there longer than some of the students have been alive? He and I sat down and had a conversation with some students who were interested in karma, and we had a good conversation. It was good. But my sense is this is normal for them. This is normal for them. It's a part of the milieu, and it has been since they can remember, that the church is marred in scandal. And so this question of trusting religion as they don't, that's the truth. And then, of course, there are many here who come to Notre Dame because they want to trust religion, right? But by and large, they don't. And so the largest, one of the largest impacts of the scandal on their lives is that the church is no longer a trusted guide on so many questions, but especially sexuality. And so what I see and experience with them is they are flailing in many ways, without good guidance, without meaningful reflection on their transition into adulthood and becoming fully fledged and responsible sexual beings. And this is, I think this is a significantly is impacted by the scandal. It's not only impacted by the scandal. Obviously, there are so many things going on in our society. But the church's ability to speak to the question of sexuality is all but moot. Moot or mute? I think moot, right? Moot. Both. Yes. Yeah. Looking at my notes. The gifts that I see have to do with their desire for relationship. So it doesn't take long for them to accept that I am their rector, and that's supposed to mean something. And that the authority that I have in their life is juridical. I mean, I've got authority that's been given to me by the institution. But it's also experienced, meaning that because I live with them, and because I get up in the middle of the night when the crisis happens, they receive me as one who has and should have authority. But that is it's an extraordinary gift that the boundaries that Father Kevin talked about and the training that we now receive, in my opinion, that gift is only enhanced by my attentiveness to boundaries. And my constant vigilance about reflecting on my own psychological well-being and my own place in this ecclesial milieu that is Notre Dame. In their life, with them. In other words, I'm living with them in a very intense way. I love them. They make up most of, if not most of my waking life, right? And yet, they are not my children, and I have professional responsibility towards them. So being able to balance that, I don't know if maybe 20 years ago people would be ready to do that, and I think the job was existing 20 years ago, and I look back at what I have learned about it, and I would be terrified, quite frankly, to be doing this kind of work 20 years ago, because the boundaries weren't there. And the ways in which this job is professionalized just was not there. So I don't have significant experience with survivors of sexual assault, but I do have significant experiences with people who are living in this church, in the aftermath of the church's loss of moral weight, and I have to say it's incalculable, and the ways in which the society is changing, partly because of that, is incalculable. And I don't have any clear answers about how we would to turn that back, but certainly one thing I would say is allowing ourselves to be humiliated. We talked about that word before, meaning being brought low. There is no way forward without it. And so the strains, quite frankly, I think, that are operating in the church that want to return to a triumphant institution must be combated. Must be combated. They look perilous to me. Yeah. I think I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you to each of our panelists. We'll open the floor and online to any questions that you'd like to pose, either about any of their remarks or our topic in general for this session. I'll also remind folks that Kim and David have both said that if you'd like to submit any questions in written form for them to read, you can feel free to also do that, and that they'll take care of reading them in a microphone. So if anyone would like to take advantage of that option. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. I've had a question spinning in my head all day, and so the three of you just happen to be the ones that are sitting in front of me when I finally had the nerve to stand up and talk about it. Because it's a question more about what is absent in this conversation, but I think talking to people who are engaged in ministry might be the most relevant place to bring it in. Even though I'm quite older than your students, I've only known a Catholic church in crisis because I'm an adult convert. I entered the church when I was almost 30, so the only Catholic church I've known is long after Dallas. I remember Father Jerry was talking about 2018, and I was like, wow, why was I not paying enough attention? I was like, oh, because that was the year I was sexually assaulted by a priest as an adult, in my mid-30s at that point. And so as I listen to the conversation, I'm always wondering, why aren't we talking about adults too in this conversation? I think Jennifer mentioned it in the very first talk early on. And I gotta think, there's gotta be a lot of us out there. Gotta be so many. I remember I was recently giving a talk at a seminary, doing some workshops about the abuse crisis and trauma and stuff. And I remember the lawyer who works with the Archdiocese of New York was there, and he was mentioning that they have no statistics, they have no figures when it comes to adults. When I read the John Jay report, they refer to us as boundary violations, which, so every time y'all have said boundary, I twitch. I'm not a boundary violation. That was assault. If my friend did it, it would have been assault. If a boyfriend did it, it would have been assault. The failure to recognize the criminality of it is hard on adult victims. The failure to talk about it as assault, to think of it as a boundary violation, is definitely making me think of what you were saying about canon law. It's a crime against his vows, not a crime against my dignity. When I went to confession immediately afterwards, the priest in confession, it was a great priest, didn't know that that was a crime. He knew it was a sin on the priest's part, but he didn't know it was a crime. He didn't know it constituted sexual assault. This is post Me Too. Well, it's 2018, so it's right kind of in the wake of Me Too. And I'm thinking about the ways our culture around us is so much better at talking about assault with adults as assault. Think about what Elizabeth was saying earlier. Yeah, no, touching, that is also assault. You know, all the anecdotes she was sharing. And, you know, I'm thinking about students on campus who are adults. If something happens to them, that is a crime. You know, it's not just the children. The children, of course, are an essential part of this conversation. I remember the lawyer for the Archdiocese of New York at that thing I was at was talking about, to reassure these seminarians, he was telling them, you know, we've come to a really good understanding of that 3% of credibly abused perpetrators of child sexual abuse. So I'm not even in that part of the conversation. But anyway, the 3% who are responsible for, by and large, the majority of offenses. And I was just like, well, what about that 97? And what about the priests who are who never touch a child, but you know, maybe an attractive friend and colleague, maybe. Anyway, this has all been turning around in my head all day, but I'm thinking about every time we go to Mass, we've got to be in a room full of victims of sex abuse every time. You know, when priests are hearing confessions, they must be hearing confessions from people who are victims of sex abuse all the time, including from priests. And the adults don't even know that they're part of the conversation a lot of times. So I just jumbled thoughts in my head. It's not really a direct question. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about that, but from a ministerial end. Because in some cases, I'm not even as interested in it on a legal end. I could have gone to civil authorities if I wanted to. I chose not to. I'm interested in it on a ministerial end as someone who's been told in confession that maybe I should just leave the church before. That was not the good ministerial approach. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious about some of your thoughts about ministering to adult victims of sex abuse by priests and including them in the conversation.
Thank you, Emily. You know what we call a convert to Catholicism? Catholic.
That's right.
It's important that you're here, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and opening this important aspect of the conversation. I'll ask panelists if you have anything. The way I receive what you're saying is that given our living, working, teaching adults who could be survivors, we would assume many are survivors. What are some of the attentivenesses you try to cultivate in yourselves, in your classrooms, in your residence halls, etc.?
You know, thank you. First of all, thank you very, very much. Every time I turn around thinking, okay, I think I've got my mind wrapped around this topic, something happens and you go, oh, gee, I am so blind. And you're absolutely correct. I think in this matter, actually, the Church of England is farther ahead because they've even published handbooks for people in ministry, kind of for how to deal with the broad reality of sexual abuse across the board when you're preaching, counseling, leading groups, etc. And, they tick through at one point, if you're preaching, because of course in the Anglicans, there are preachers, people ordained just to preach. And you could have in your congregation, adults who have been assaulted, people who've been assaulted as children, whether by people in the church or outside the church. You could have offenders in there, active offenders in your congregation. You could have incest survivors, incest perpetrator. I mean, they just kept listing it, and it was like, whoa. I don't think, and interestingly, that came out around, I think, about 2018 as well. And then also in 2018 with the McCarrick affair, you got to see, at least in the church context, those were adults, that McCarrick was assaulting. So, I'm humbled, and thank you. And I think it gets back to actually, Eric, what you had said. It's so much easier, for instance, to talk about, when I think about these commandments, that I was working with in moral theology. It's so much easier to rattle off all the ways you can offend against the seventh commandment, you shall not steal. We've got Catholic social teaching, and we do the 13th, and we've got, all this stuff about economic analysis and all this kind of stuff, and labor and what have you, and everybody's fine. But to talk about sexuality and to talk about sexual assault, we don't do a very good job. We still don't. So I think I would just say, I am sorry that I'm not more aware. I know what I did with my own research. I mean, the focus was so much on these really, horrendous serial pedophiles, and, at the time, 2002, 2007, but that was then, and that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Emily, let me just add, in addition to Anselmo, my own gratitude for the courage of your voice this evening. Glad that you're here. Thank you for speaking, first and foremost. And I just want to echo that you're right, absolutely so, in raising the issue of our not taking into account adults' assault and abuse. And it's only something, as sort of the crisis has continued to unfold, that it's one part of it that the church hasn't yet come to terms with. And some of the same ideas about particularly transparency and the right sort of reporting within the church, and especially in concert with other competent authorities, right? Whether, for instance, with the university, and Eric can speak about that, university or otherwise, civil is really important. And we haven't thought about that fully yet with adults. And just here as a minister on a university campus, and Eric can speak to this even more than I can, but I encounter it too, not only in residence halls, but even as one who teaches in a graduate school. These are issues, especially the assault of adults, that exist even in universities as well. And they're hard ones to come to terms with because it's tough to be transparent about them, but that's what's really required. And so I think you're really right to point out that when people use rhetoric that talks about, for instance, the 3% of priests and not the other 97, it's missing completely the formation of the whole within which even adults, whether vulnerable or not, might be kept safe. So I just want to affirm that. I think you're right on the mark, and it's a giant improvement.
Emily, thank you for sharing your story. I know Emily, and we've talked a bit about this before, and about this topic in particular, and been thinking about it since we did. And I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. I am thinking about, it sounds like, from what I know of your story and stories not unlike it, right? So there's is one option to cover up and dismiss, and the other option, litigation, right? An example would be at the university, one of there is students who experience, who enter into the Title IX system because of some alleged assault, can opt if both students involved. It's not available, okay, first of all, to students, to people of non-equal status. So they'd have to be both students to use the mediation experience. And that's an option in our situation, when we also know that the majority of the sexual assaults between adults is happening, probably between adults and children, but it's happening between people who know each other already, right? Have some kind of established relationship. And so the question is, well, how do we then, I think part is people are just afraid to even talk about it, because it seems like once you start talking about it, the outcomes are already prescribed, right? There is only one outcome, right? And that outcome is punitive and legal. And institutions like human bodies are seeking equilibrium at all costs. Don't want any movement, just want stability. So I think that I don't know if I don't believe that that should be the only outcome. Is a legal proceeding leading potentially to conviction, right? But so that I think perhaps the question is can there be an open conversation about something that is not dismissal of the issue, or criminal charges? Because the reality is, if it were only criminal charges, there would be a lot more people in jail, and we know that. So how would you know? And maybe that's the right thing. I don't know, but I think what I hear in people's voices is fear around those questions. So when a rector, for example, is made aware, and which is the case for, frankly, all university officials, when they're not exercising the ministry of confession or the ministry of sacrament of reconciliation, is a mandatory reporter. And so I have a legal responsibility to report any indication of sexual assault that's happened on this campus, or potentially around campus. And my job is to go up, it's not to go out. And so as it goes up, a legal proceeding is not the only option for the student who is the complainant, but it's potentially one. So we're bound up in this institution, and I think the other question is, all those other institutions, like a religious order or the diocese, is going to have a set of criteria and conditions, and I think there is a piece of the people are operating, particularly with adults, operating out of fear. Where is this going to go? How far does this go? And what does it mean to hold a minister, a person of authority, whether it be a priest or a deacon or a lay minister who has, kind of some kind of juridical authority, accountable? What does it look like? And where are the space for people to make legitimate mistakes, whatever that means, right? That don't lead to, I don't know. I'm sure that there are others in the room who have a better sense of that.
Thank you, friends. We're at time. It's been a long day. We have a lot more to do this weekend and tomorrow. I'm just going to check with our conference conveners real quick to see if they have any announcements. But as we tie up here, could you please join me again in thanking our panelists?